Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Rebecca West. I'm the curator for the Plains Indian Museum. And before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, this is the time when you need to unplug, turn off your cell phones and other devices, please. And I also want to remind you of two upcoming Draper Natural History Museum programs. We have another one coming up this month on June 19th, and this will be at 5:15 in the evening, and this is our Draper After Dark lecture. And it will feature Dr. Michael Demek, who's assistant professor of biology at Adelphi University, and he will be presenting How Fast Did Dinosaurs Grow Up? Hope you can join us for that. And then in July, and please note, this will be the second week in July because of the holiday. And this will be the Lunchtime Expedition Lecture by Robert B. Smith, who's an emeritus professor of geophysics at the University of Utah. And he will be speaking on the anatomy of Old Faithful and the Upper Geyser Basin and its ties to the Yellowstone Magma Reservoir. So put those on your calendars and please join us. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today, Jon Majanwski. He's an ethnobotanist who lives what he studies and he studies what he lives. And legend has it that Jon came out to the Red Desert of Wyoming in the 1960s to follow his passion for wild landscapes, largely uninhabited by humans, but thriving with the plants and the animals that he loves to study. He broke down and managed to make it to a little place called Atlantic City, Wyoming, not to be confused with Atlantic City, New Jersey. And lo and behold, he's still here. He never left. He's worked for the U.S. Forest Service tracking bighorn sheep. He's taught ethnobotany at Central Wyoming College, and he's also done field studies of grizzly bears, mountain goats, pronghorn, elk, pika, and many other marvelous creatures. He's written a book on goat packing. And I can say as a former goat owner, this takes a special kind of patience and talent, both with the goat wrangling and the book writing. Jon recently created a film for the Native Memories Project featuring Native elders' knowledge of plants for both food and medicine. This is information that's embedded in Native traditions, and he is here to share his knowledge of Native plant uses in the greater Yellowstone region, their ancient origins, and their presence in today's physical and cultural landscapes. Please welcome Jon Majanwski.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I had a delightful morning driving up from Du Bois, where I was at a meeting last night, and having a little reunion in Yellowstone Park, because I haven't been there in a long time, and like over a decade. And it's a special place. If you haven't been in the backcountry of Yellowstone, I know you've all been in Yellowstone, but the backcountry is a very special place that I became attached to because I spent 3 years in the backcountry. And often skiing in the winter from one hot spring to another, looking for bears that might have come out of the dens. But it's been my good fortune to work in the backcountry of the Yellowstone ecosystem for most of my career, about 45 years, and get to practice what I love to do, which is go into a place and find food and eventually get to the point where I don't have to bring any in and not lose weight. Anybody can stay in the backcountry for a month, but be able to stay there and be comfortable and not lose weight and find plenty to eat is a good thing. And that's been my hobby for a long time, since I was a kid, because my grandfather was my first mentor, and I'd spend my summers with him when I was 8 or 9 years old. And he grew up in southern Poland in the mountains. He had a farm there. but it was part of his family's tradition to go out and always gather food plants and medicines for the winter and preserve them and utilize them. And somehow I came away from that believing that doctors are for setting bones and doing surgery, and everything else you're supposed to do yourself and find your own medicines in the woods. So I would help him gather plants, and it kind of became a life way for me. I still do it, and I teach classes on how people can gather their own medicines and plants from the wild. And they often work as well or better than the synthetic drugs. In fact, most of our synthetic drugs originally came from plants, and the only reason they were synthesized is to extend the shelf life or to be able to measure them more accurately. So we're going to talk about some of those things. I picked out a few of the more interesting plants, at least they're interesting to me, that occur between here and the west boundary of Yellowstone Park. And I can say that I have used most of these plants. There's only a few I don't use, and you'll see why when we get there. But these are by no means all of them. We're just going to touch the tip of the iceberg with some interesting ones that I think you'll like, and talk about stories associated with them. So this is Yampa. Yampa is a mainstay. It was the pasta of the tribes in this region. All of them used it. All of them had a name for it. But they all knew the name Yampa because it was traded. It was such an important food item that all the tribes would trade for it. And they would use a common name. So when all of the tribes had the same name for a plant, it meant that it was very important as a trade item. And this one was gathered up for the roots. You could see the whole plant there. It stands about 2 feet tall, 16 inches to 2 feet, depending on the growing conditions. And you could see at the bottom, it's got a root that forks. And usually it looks like this. It has 2 roots. And sometimes there's 8 or 9 roots, but for the most part, there's going to be 2. So the Crow name for this is double root or twin root. But the Shoshone name for it is Yump or Yump. And when the Shoshones first migrated here, they came from the western Shoshone territory in Nevada and Southern California. About 9,000 years ago, the archaeologists figure, and they called themselves the Yambadika, which is the Yampa eaters. That's how important this was. Their name, often tribal names reflect what they eat or what's important to them. It's usually what they eat. So the Yambadika were the Shoshones when they arrived, and then they got the horse and they became buffalo people. They became the Gwich'indika. And probably the earliest group to arrive here was the Mountain Shoshone, which lived at the higher elevations in Yellowstone Park, all the way down the Absarokas into the southern wind rivers and into the Red Desert. And those were the Dukadika, the sheep eaters. So this was used by all of these people, and when something was so important that they would all congregate in one place to gather it, partly because there were a lot of those plants there and partly because it was easy digging, then they would name that place after the plant. So the valley where Jackson Hole is the Yampa Valley. And the river flowing through it is the Yampa River. And that was the name of it until 1860 when Colonel William Reynolds conducted a survey, part of the Hayden survey, and officially noted it as the Snake River. And the Snake River is a misnomer. It was an artifact of an unfortunate mistranslation of a sign language word for a plant that the Shoshones associated themselves with. And we'll get to that later. But the Shoshones became known as the Snakes because of how they introduced themselves in sign language, but it's not really their name. So as we go into the lowlands, down around here, we find another member of the carrot family. Yampa's in the carrot family. Most of the plants that tribal people made bread out of were in the carrot family. These were roots that were ground into flour with a mano and metate and laboriously ground until you got a flour, and then they were dampened and pressed into cakes. And then that's how they were preserved. And you'd rehydrate those and bake them in a small oven to make bread out of them. This is another one. This is bulbous biscuit root. Here's two other ones that grow at this elevation that all of the tribes favored for bread making. The one on the left is Fendler's spring parsley. The one on the right is bulbous spring parsley, and they're very closely related members of the carrot family. They are up right now. Last weekend we were out in the Red Desert gathering these, and they are endless. And if you go along the Absaroka Divide from Pahaska north up along the park boundary, you'll go up on these high ridges that form the park boundary, and you'll see lots of related plants that look like this. The one common one that was gathered up there by the mountain Shoshone, the Dukadika, was called Lomatium cows, or cow's biscuit root. Cows is the name of a botanist. But cow's biscuit root is very common up there. And if you look closely at the ground, you'll see chips that people often take as the byproduct of making arrowheads or spearheads or tools of other kinds. But actually, those were chips that were made specifically for taking the bark off of these roots, because if you wait a half hour after pulling these roots out of the ground, it's hard to get the bark off, and you have to process them by taking the bark off. So there's little rocks that are about the size of this. They fit between your 3 fingers, and that's perfect way to grab a root and peel the bark off while it's fresh within the first few minutes of getting it out of the ground, because the inner root is very succulent and damp. The outer root is the protection, and it's dry. And you need to get the bark off right away. So all these tools were kind of fabricated on the spur of the moment to get the bark off and then thrown away, and you could make another one in a minute just by sharpening an edge of any old stone. But that's why I believe that Absaroka Divide is littered with little obsidian chips that are about this size. So this was another mainstay. There were other members of the biscuit root family. These previous plants were biscuit roots. And this is desert parsley. It's probably one of the best antimicrobial drugs we know. The reason you can't buy it at a pharmacy is because no one's figured out how to synthesize the roots of these plants. So it's a medicine. The root is a medicine. It's one of the medicines that was highly prized by all of the tribes in this area. The Shoshones call it doza. The Crows call it lightning root, because they say it is so powerful that it gets its energy from lightning. When lightning strikes the ground, it goes out underground for miles, which it actually does. And that's the energy that this plant absorbs, and why it's such a great healing plant. When and the tops, you can see the tops there on the lower right, were used as a pot herb. They're very edible, very tasty, kind of like parsley. That's why this plant's called desert parsley. And it has a yellow flower. And these pot herbs, the abundant leaf production was thrown into pots, thrown into stews and soups, and dried for winter use. So it's a very common plant and very usable as food also. But the root is highly valued for its antipathogenic properties, which still haven't been fully analyzed and determined. But when the AIDS epidemic came through and pharmacies were looking for pharmaceutical research facilities were looking for a drug that would treat the AIDS virus, and none of the synthetic ones worked. They finally turned to the herbal medicine ones, and the two primary ones that were used to study were this one, lightning root, and Osha root. Whoop. Oop. There it is, Osha root. This is Osha. The top is the flowering part. Looks a little bit like water hemlock, which is poisonous. So if you collect these, you ought to be careful and know what you're looking for, or go with somebody who knows. This is the leaf of it, which is a very tasty, edible leaf. It's a pot herb when it's older, but when it's young, you can eat it raw. And it's got a vague celery taste, a little bit of parsley taste. Very tasty salad green. But the root looks like this. It's large. It can be a foot long and with multiple side roots. Also very, very useful, and most tribal people carry a little bit of this root on them at all times because it's good in emergencies. You can use it on an open wound to keep it from getting infected. You could smudge it and breathe in the smoke when you light it to fight bacterial lung infections. It's also a bronchial dilator, so it helps with prolonged pneumonia. And it also contains oxytocin, which is a hormone that people produce in order to bond. So oxytocin is what a woman produces when she has a child. In order to bond with it, it allows you to bond with that kid no matter what he turns out to be. And you may normally not like him, but you would bond with him with oxytocin in your bloodstream. So that's why this root was used in the sweat lodges, so that everyone could sing songs and function as a unit, as a community. They would smudge this in the sweat lodges, throw it on a hot rock, and let the smoke permeate the air. Actually smells pretty good that way. So that's Osha. Again, a root that has the same name whether you're in Mexico or Alaska. All of the tribes knew it by that name, even though they had their own tribal name for it. If you wanted to trade, you could use that term, and they all knew what it was. The Shoshones call it bear root. And the Crow name for it is Essay. So, another staple food are the five-needle pines. We have both lumber pine and white bark pine here. Both were used as a fallback food. They were used on a regular basis in the fall of the year when they were gathered. You could make a gruel out of it, a porridge out of the ground up seeds, the pine nuts. You could mix it in with soups as a flavoring, or you could store it underground, dig a hole, bury it, and come back a year later and harvest them. And they actually taste better after being buried in the ground for a year. And by fallback food, I mean in the moon of starvation, which is usually when all of your food ran out after a long winter, and the hunters haven't come home with any new meat. This is a tremendous protein source, very high protein plant, the pine nuts. But it also has a balanced level of carbohydrates that are completely digestible, and fats that are of the good kind, omega-3 and omega-6 fats. So it's very much a perfect balanced diet to eat nothing but pine nuts, because you don't get the vitamins and the antioxidants you would get from green vegetables, so you need to mix that in. But if you had nothing else to eat, you could survive a long time on nothing but pine nuts. And limber pine is the low elevation one we have here. But up higher, and that's what the Crows, the buffalo hunters, Shoshones would have eaten, the Blackfeet. But if you go higher, where the mountain Shoshone lived, and it was white bark pine, and that has a closed cone. It never opens up unless it's heated. So you have to put it around a campfire to get those pine nuts out. And that's where you find a lot of these very large mountain Shoshone villages in the Wind Rivers and in Yellowstone Park, where there are hundreds of flattened out lodge pads where a lodge once sat. And these are mountain lodges that look like teepees. I found several of them in my years in the mountains that were still standing, and a lot of them that were blown over next to a flat pad. And in that pad you'll often find artifacts, stone tools. The largest one ever found is in the Wind Rivers at Whiskey Mountain, where the sheep range is. And those were Duca people, sheep eaters. They were right along the sheep migration route that goes into the high mountains. But it's also in a forest of whitebark pine, so they had a perfect setup for gathering food without having to go far. Yes, that was me in the last century. I was happily eating pine nuts in the 70s and thought they were pretty good food, and they're really easy to gather and collect large quantities of, especially if you do it the way grizzlies do. They don't pick the individual nuts out of a pine cone. They raid squirrel caches, and squirrels always cache more pine nuts than they need because of bears. And you can dig out a gallon of pine nuts from one squirrel cache without having to work too hard. This was an 1870 photograph by William Henry Jackson, taken about 5 miles from where I live, which is a limber pine forest. It's the only place in North America where limber pine is the climax species at maturity. So all of the trees, unless they're hit by lightning and you have a fire, all of the climax trees at the end of the forest succession is limber pine. And a lot of these have been cut down because this happens to be about 3 miles from the new proposed state capital of Wyoming, which was South Pass City in 1870. Except you couldn't get a railroad there, so they changed it to Cheyenne. But it had more people than Cheyenne at this time. There were about 8,000 people 3 miles from this traditional pine nut gathering camp of Chief Washakie and his Shoshones. So the cambium layer of the pine trees are also edible. But the most nutritious part of the cambium layer of pine trees is the pine bark beetle grubs, which are native to North America. And when you have a lot of pine bark beetles, they were harvested as food, and they're really very tasty. So bears gather those. This is a squirrel cache. So this is what bears go after. This one, if you look close, was dug up several times by bears in past years. So it's very rough terrain. But surrounding it is the dominant understory of the high elevation whitebark pine, and that is grouse whortleberry, which is a type of huckleberry. The huckleberries, though, are red. They're delicious. They taste just like huckleberries or blueberries. They have a lot of antioxidants in them, but they only produce a good high production yield about every 5 years or so. But the Indians would gather these leaves of huckleberries as what's called an old people's medicine, and it's used to prevent blindness. So a lot of what I'm telling you isn't in the books, but we got it from the Native Memory Project, which Rebecca mentioned I'm a part of, and it's a group of us that believe we should spend some energy finding Native American elders who want to talk about the old pre-reservation ways of doing things in stories. And we put them on camera and get them to talk in their native language and in English, and sometimes in sign language. And we'll get the stories from people who were raised by their grandparents who lived before the reservation time. And that's how we learned about this plant being used as a prevention of blindness, and it actually does work. It has a catechin compound in it called OPC, which prevents capillary fragility, which is related to the cause of macular degeneration. So this is an old people's disease, and it's treatable with this. chemical, OPC, oligomeric proanthocyanidin, which is abundant in not only the berries but also the leaves. And that's true of all of the members of the huckleberry family. So here's thin-leafed huckleberry, which also produces the same chemical, but it has blue or purple berries. So both the berries were made into a tea, according to the ethnobotanical books. But actually, when you talk to the people who drank these teas, it was a fruit juice. It was a fruit juice like blueberry juice you buy in the store. And it could be thickened into a pudding by adding flour to it. And the flour they used was usually wild carrots, like the biscuit roots. Although it could be Indian rice grass and a few other things. There are many things that made flour from. And here is maybe the most popular berry amongst all of the tribes, chokecherry. Chokecherry was used as a dessert. It was pounded into meat as pemmican. It was drank as a fruit juice with meals or just between meals. And it's called a tea, chokecherry tea, but it's made from berries and it's fairly thick and it's actually a fruit juice. So they had lots of fruit juices that they used for energy. But chokecherry was the most common, it's the most abundant producer, and it produces virtually every year. Most of the other berries don't do that. So you can depend on it. The Shoshones make a wonderful pudding that I've had many times with Shoshone meals called gotsup. It's made from the pounded berries. They were pounded with the seed inside. It's got a hard seed in there. Most people who eat chokecherries spit out that seed. The Indians ground up the seeds with the berries, part of their tradition to do it that way. And then they added flour to it to make a pudding, which is delicious. Most meals I've had on reservations had chokecherry, no matter what tribe it is. They had a chokecherry pudding or a chokecherry drink or a side dish, along with meat and everything else. So the interesting thing about this is that last year there was a study done, a biomedical study, to show that chokecherry pudding in the traditional fashion, made by pounding the seeds in with the berries, was studied clinically and found to prevent tumor growth, to stop tumor growth of cancers, and to improve cardiovascular health by strengthening the intima integrity of the blood vessels, which is the cause of atherosclerosis, is a deterioration of the intima layer, the inside lining of the arteries and veins. So this was a very successful study. It was done by a medical student who was Shoshone Paiute. And it confirms some of the stories you hear from the elders when you talk to them, that they didn't have much in the way of disease prior to the reservation time. Things were very different, and their foods were their medicine. They rarely used a medicine separate from food. So a lot of these roots that are medicinal were stuck into a pot and stirred around for a certain amount of time to release the medicine into a pot of soup or stew. And often that's how they said they applied medicine to somebody that needed it. And chokecherry was not only a food and a medicine, but it was a building material. Anytime you needed a very hard hardwood to make something out of, chokecherry was one of the first preferences because it's flexible when it's fresh. When you cut it off a tree, branches are very flexible, but when it dries out, it hardens into a super hardwood that doesn't tend to fracture and check and break down later. So this little cage for the kids in this travois was made out of chokecherry, which is the traditional wood to make these cages out of for migration, so the kids don't bounce out when you're running down a trail to your next camp. It looks like it'd be a hard ride, especially at a gallop, but actually the bottom of that hide, there's a rawhide piece suspended between the two travois poles, and on top of the rawhide is a pad, a very soft pad. And I have one small version of it I made here. It's made out of deer skin with cattail fluff in it. You know, when cattails in the fall start to seed out, they have an airborne seed that has a lot of fluff on it that can go straight up in the air with a mild wind, and it can travel for 10 or 20 miles that way. That's how cattails spread their range into new swamps and wetlands. And you can come up later and feel this. It's just stuffed with cattail fluff, and they made sitting pads out of this. They insulated leggings, they insulated vests for wintertime use, and it was as good as down. It's just like K-Pack. Back in World War II, they were making life vests out of this. If it gets wet, it's no good, so you have to keep it dry, but it can be a good padding for insulation and for flotation. Also, cattails were harvested for the roots, which were the roots and the lower stems were cut up and thrown into soup pots or fried with buffalo fat. The rhizomes, the lateral roots that go out to the side, were pounded into flour and mixed with other wild carrots to make mixtures for bread and biscuits. Also, fireweed was one of the fluff insulators they used to make clothing and to make pillows and sitting things for wintertime, and pads for children. They also made insulated blankets for kids in the cradle boards out of fireweed. And that was the seed, again, that has a airborne fluff to it. But fireweed was much more important for its food value. It was used a lot and gathered up and dried for winter use. The leaves are very nutritious. They contain a lot of B vitamins and vitamin C, but they also contain some interesting polyphenolic antioxidants. Quercetin is the main one, which is a fungicide. It also stimulates an immune response. So these leaves were mashed up between the hands if they were fresh and then applied directly to an open wound to prevent infection. What did that is the quercetin mostly, but also another terpenoid compound called enothin, which stimulates collagen growth so that the wound heals up quicker. It's also an anti-cancer drug. So this was used on any kind of skin problem, especially if it's related to a fungus or an abnormal growth in the skin. And it can be used now. You can treat yellow toenail fungus, for instance, by just putting a poultice of this on the whole toe and keep it wet with that poultice for about 5 days, and it goes away. But it's in the evening primrose family. You see it has 4 petals. This is also in the evening primrose family. It is probably the sweetest smelling plant in the world. It's called Enothera cespitosum, and I gave you the Latin name because the drug that came from this that is now synthesized is called enothin, and almost all drugs are named after the plant they originally came from, the genus name. This is the cespitose or rock rose evening primrose. Once it's fertilized, it turns pink and it loses its smell. It's no longer a fragrant plant, but it was used as a perfume additive. Many plants used as perfumes. But this one contains a large quantity of enothin, and it's mostly in the root. And like I said, that stimulates healing, speeds up the healing process by stimulating collagen growth in the skin. It's used for ectodermal injuries, abnormal growths, or infections. So it became the first suppository, and it's very effective for that. Yes, Indians got hemorrhoids just like the rest of us, and this is what they use, and it's very effective because of the enothin that's in here. This theoretically would also be used for colorectal cancer. So milkweed is an interesting one because it has a lot of functions. First of all, it's a delicious food. But you have to boil it 3 times because it's a poisonous food. So the latex sap that comes out of it when you cut the stem is full of proteolytic enzymes, which will dissolve your esophagus while you're swallowing it, which is not a good thing. So you boil it 3 times. You take these plants when they're about 3 or 4 inches to 6 inches tall, and that's when they're most succulent and tender. And they taste exactly like asparagus. But you have to boil them 3 times. So that explains the other uses for this plant, because besides being a very highly sought after food, the sap, the latex it's called, which is a white sap, is abundant in this plant. If you cut the stem, you'll get huge droplets of this latex pouring out of the stem. And that's where the proteolytic enzyme is. And therefore, you can break down protein with this enzyme. And that's why it was a meat tenderizer. You just collect that sap, put it on meat and pound it in, and it breaks down the proteins into their component peptides and amino acids. So it's since pre-cooking the meat. It was also used for people with a weak heart, and that was the root that was used, because it contains a different chemical called wabane, which is a cardiac glycoside. It effectively slows down the heart rate, allows the heart to rest, but maintaining a superior amplitude of the heart pulse so that circulation is not compromised, but the heart is allowed to heal up muscle damage or weakness, which can occur from starvation or dehydration. Severe dehydration causes you to digest your own heart, and then you have to rebuild it. It takes years, but this speeds up the process by stimulating myocardial metabolism. And the other use for it is for poison arrows, because for the same reason that this cardiac glycoside rests the heart, if you shoot it directly into a muscle where it goes into the bloodstream very rapidly, and then you cause an animal to run and exert itself, it'll cause a heart attack, and you kill an animal with poison arrows that way. So the interesting thing to me about this is that you look at milkweed, and then you go to Ethiopia, and you look at this tree called elephant tree. It's also in the same family milkweed is in the Asclepiadaceae family. And it contains very similar white sap. So when I was on an expedition to collect plants and animals in Ethiopia, a biological expedition in 1984, and that gave me an opportunity to talk to some of the native people who lived in this area and knew a lot about these plants, but we'd ask through an interpreter how they use these plants. And what did they tell us? They used it as a meat tenderizer, and for people with a weak heart, and for poison arrows. So 2 plants in the same family, they don't look anything like each other. They're on opposite sides of the earth. But the ancient civilizations that lived with these plants figured out how to use the chemistry inside these plants for exactly the same thing that we use them for. So modern chemistry has figured out how wabane works. Wabane, by the way, is derived from the Somali word wabaya, which means poison arrow. But this cardiac glycoside is now manufactured as a heart medicine. Only we learned it about 9,000 years after the Indians learned how to do it. So when we say that we have a superior knowledge of chemistry and physiology, I reject that. I think the ancient cultures had a way of establishing the use of chemistry and plant chemicals and how they worked in physiology a long time ago. They just came at chemistry from a different angle. Okay, go try this one. So this is the flower. Looks very much like a milkweed flower, but this is on the elephant tree, Adenium obesum. These are the people we interviewed find out how they use these plants, and every plant had a use for either food or medicine in that western part of Ethiopia. So we have bee balm, which is called Oregano de la Sierra in New Mexico, because this plant tastes like oregano, but it grows in the mountains. And the Indians used it for flavoring food. It's an oregano flavor, but a little sweeter. The leaf actually smells quite sweet, and therefore was used as perfume. And in fact, the Lakota name for this plant is Wape Washtemna, which means the sweet-smelling leaf. So this was one of the things mixed with pineapple weed and mint for women's perfume. They braided these plants right into their hair, and it smells wonderful when it's combined in the right way. Sedges, another plant that can be pounded into roots, or the roots pounded into flower, very common in the mountains. That's what was done with it. Additive for other flowers. This is water sedge. All of the sedges are edible. Here we are gathering some in the wind rivers. But also, after you're done eating it, you can use the tops. Paiutes in western Shoshone and a lot of tribes actually made baskets from the tops of these sedges, and they wove them while they're green and then let them shrink as they dried, and it makes a watertight basket without having to coat it with anything. So here's one of those baskets. This is an Ethiopian one, similar to the one in the picture, but they look identical to the Paiute baskets. So this ancient knowledge is pretty worldwide. Elk thistle is a plant you know as Everett's thistle in Yellowstone Park because of Truman Everett's amazing story of surviving a Hayden expedition after getting lost and spending over a month hiking out and eating almost nothing but this thistle, elk thistle. Besides being very tasty, having more vitamin C than oranges, and having a lot of B vitamins, if you peel off the thorns and the bristles, it's also used as a rubbing stick. So this, before toothbrushes, people had rubbing sticks. They had two things in common. When you sever the branch in some cases, but in this case the main stem, with a sharp knife, little vascular tubes extrude automatically, and they become a brush. And then you brush your mouth with it, you brush your teeth with it, and you spit, and it's green. That's because these plants that were used as rubbing sticks had loosely bound chlorophyll in the cells, and they would break down, and the chlorophyll would fill your mouth. And that is what kills bacteria. They're an oxidizing agent. So they had it all figured out. It's probably why grizzly bears have pretty good smelling breath. I had the opportunity to smell the breath of one once when I lured one into my sleeping bag, and I was doing an experiment to show that they really didn't attack people in this one area on Jones Creek, which had the highest rate of grizzly attacks in the United States in 1974. And I was hired to find out why. And I found out they weren't attacking people. They were scaring people out of their tents so they could go in and get the food. So they were being polite. But to prove that, I had to lay out in a sleeping bag without a tent and show that they would come around and not bother me because I did not have any food smell and I didn't have any tent. So this one first bear came up, and a large boar circled my sleeping bag a few times and then came over and put his nose right down to my nose and blew real quick. That's what they do when they want to smell something. They blow and then they inhale. Kind of disturbs whatever they're trying to smell, and then the odors come back into their nostril. And I was totally surprised by how clean that bear's breath smelled. So bitterroot is used to thicken soups and stews. Sagebrush is an amazing plant. It's a fungicide, has phellandrine, which is a fungicide terpene, and it has a chemical artemisinin, which is a lactone glycoside. If you go to Africa today, you take that same artemisinin, it's called artemisinin now, but it's used for malaria. Of course, it's important for all the wildlife. The Shoshones call sagebrush bohovi, and sagebrush is used for external use only, but if you want to take it internally for parasites, then you take the little brother of sagebrush, which is fringed sage, and that's what they worm their horses with, and they worm people with it too. Works on giardia and a number of other things. This white sage is another sagewort. It's not woody, so it's called a sagewort. And they're all used internally because they have less camphor. But the sagebrushes were what you lined your pit with if you're storing pine nuts and roots under the ground, because the philandrine and the artemisinin and thuol, which is one of the oils in here, repels rodents, insects, and fungus. So you could store pine nuts underground with sagebrush as a liner for the pit. It's the only way you could store these things underground, or mice and voles are going to eat it by the next day. So that was a little trick they had. Of course, it doesn't repel bears. Bears get around sagebrush pretty good. So to prevent bears from getting into your pine nuts, we had very illustrative stories of this. They would put a hide down, a rawhide, animal hide down over the pit that had the food in it, and everybody would leave camp, and then the two men would stay behind and drink a lot of water and pee on that hide. They'd shovel dirt on it and urinate on it for a couple of days, and bears will not go into that hole. And we proved that on the grizzly study. So we all peed around our tents every night. Okay, this is a perfume, another perfume, pineapple weed called Nua Nadega in the Shoshone language, which means Indian perfume. This is Alakshibio in the Crow language, which means abortion plant. Very important to the Crow religion because this plant blocks the production of luteinizing hormone. Pituitary gland produces luteinizing hormone, and it's necessary in order for the fertilized egg to implant. And if it doesn't implant, you don't get pregnant. And in the Crow tradition, dating back to the time of creation, they were advised not to have more than one child per family. They're the only tribe I know of where that was a rule. It wasn't an edict, it was a suggestion that life would be easier if they only had one child per family. You could adopt as many as you wanted, but one biological child. So this plant was essential. It was given to them as a way to accomplish this. So the woman would make a tea out of any part of this plant. They saved the roots for winter and the upper parts in summer and took it as a contraceptive. FDA studied the contraceptive qualities of this plant, and the active principle is called polyphenotic acid in 1948, and it was found to be a safe and effective contraceptive then. But the Indians knew about it since the time of creation. And finally, we have black tree lichen, which grows in Yellowstone and in Montana, and it's what they made Jell-O out of. It makes a Jell-O that looks just like any other Jell-O, except it's black, and it has no flavor. So they added June berries to it, or you might know them as Saskatoon berries, or it has other names. Can't think right now. They're very sweet, sweetest berry there is. So they would make Jell-O out of this by steaming it underground in pits for about 20 to 30 hours, and I've done it. You can make it in a steamer at home, and it is a very nice Jell-O that you can make. This is the plant itself. It's black, looks like hair, sometimes called horsehair lichen. And according to the Shoshone stories and Salish stories, Nawazi uses this to put over his body as a camouflage. And Nawazis live in this kind of forest where there's usually a lot of rainfall and a lot of this lichen hanging from the trees. So you walk through a forest of this, and it's kind of freaky and eerie. you can imagine seeing things. But anybody know what Nawazi is? What species of animal that is? It's the Shoshone word for the wild man, or Sasquatch. And this is what he camouflaged himself with when he was hiding from people. So, that's what it looks like. There's a Sasquatch in there somewhere. You can almost see it. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.